This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 44 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, October 29th, 1910. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. A pleasant social gathering took place last Friday evening at the Congregational Parsonage when Mrs. Wallace entertained the recently organized Christian Education Society. There were about 20 present, and a happy evening was enjoyed with games, music, and refreshments. She was the wife of the pastor, Reverend David Wallace. A recent guest of Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Howard's has been Mrs. Susie Richardson, whose home for a number of years has been in California, but whose early home was in Tyngsboro. Her husband, Samuel Richardson, pleasantly recalls his student days at Westford Academy. Mr. and Mrs. Lafayette Porter of Presque Isle, Maine, were guests this week at the Congregational Parsonage. They were former parishioners of Mr. Wallace's at Presque Isle. Miss Alice M. Howard has been having a short vacation from her library duties at Cotuit, at her home in the westerly part of our town. I think she actually lived on Howard Road. The next meeting of the Tadmont Club will be an open meeting, and a cordial invitation is extended to all to be present and hear Frank H. Hill's address on, quote, conflicting ideals in education, end quote. Mr. Hill is superintendent of schools, and his presentation of so timely a subject should be of interest to all parents, teachers, and friends. Everybody will be very welcome, and it is sincerely hoped a large audience will greet Mr. Hill next Tuesday at Library Hall at 3 o'clock. Workmen have been busy at the Whitney Park this week. The entire surface has been rolled with a heavy roller, and the various sections have been staked out preparatory to having the shrubbery put in place. The tennis court, some of the fine days this past week, has received an appreciative patronage. The dual athletic meet held at Littleton last Saturday afternoon is reported by our young people most enthusiastically as a thoroughly good time. 28 went in the big three-horse barge guided by genial Fred Smith. The honors in the various contests were graciously conceded to the visitors. Presumably, this was all skill on their part and not because the Littleton hosts were too polite to supersede their guests. The judges were William E. Wright and Dr. Cyril A. Blaney. A fine supper was served at the town hall at the close of the meet. Reverend David Wallace, Houghton G. Osgood, Leonard Wheeler, the Mrs. Carrie and Lillian Atwood, and Mrs. Alice Lambert attended the Fall Conference of Churches at Lancaster on Wednesday. Miss Ida Layton has been doing substitute work for Miss Mary Bunce at the library. Mr. Augustus Bunce, Mary's father, is quite comfortable at his home, but the physician's directions are rather a restraint from emulating the strenuous life. The prolonged drought is proving rather serious to the residents removed from the water supply. One man was heard to say this week that if conditions continued, he should have to resort to selling his cattle. Many reports come of great inconvenience and some actual deprivation. The poles are nearly all set for the new Parkerville telephone line, and part of the wiring is done, but it will still be some time before the subscribers, of which there are a good number, are enjoying the service. These are listed with their numbers in the new telephone book. Miss Elizabeth Hildreth of New York City is spending the autumn weeks with her cousin, Miss Ella Hildreth, at Prospect Hill Farm. That's the what's now the house at 33 Main Street, across from Muffins on Main. Mrs. Harry N. Jakes and Miss Dorothy, who was Harry's daughter, of Malden, were over Sunday guests at William Sutherland's, Harry's in-laws and Dorothy's grandparents. The next section is the Westford Grange paragraph. There was a large attendance at the Grange last Thursday evening for the conferring of the third and fourth degrees, followed by the harvest supper. The third degree work was done by the ladies' degree staff in their most creditable manner. It was under the direction of Wiley M. Wright as drill master. Mrs. Fred L. Snow was master of the staff, and Mrs. Alonzo Sutherland and Mrs. Gould were the assistants. Fred Smith and Catherine Burke conducted the picturesque Harvest March. The fourth degree was conferred by the regular officers. A communication from Acton Grange stated that owing to having received a number of similar invitations to other Granges for Neighbors' Night, they would be unable to come to Westford. Littleton Grange was invited with Groton Grange for November 17th. The beautiful and appetizing harvest supper was under the direction of Fred Smith and a group of capable assistants. There were patrons present from Chelmsford and Littleton. The next paragraph is titled Meeting. The combined missionary meeting and prayer service on Tuesday at the Congregational Vestry was well sustained and of much interest. The service was in charge of Mrs. Wallace, and the study for the afternoon was Missions in Mexico. The Mrs. Burnham, Lawrence, and Crocker, Mrs. Gould, Mrs. J.B. Fletcher, and Mr. Wallace carried out the various parts, after which Miss Lillian Atwood read a most interesting account of the pilgrimage she and Miss May Atwood made on Columbus Day to Andover and Bradford for the dedication of the Boulder tablet at the latter place, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. It was the annual business meeting for the local society, and the following officers were elected: Miss Sarah W. Loker, President; Mrs. Leonard Wheeler, Vice President; Mrs. David Wallace, Secretary and Treasurer. Next, we have the section on the Congregational Church. Rally Sunday at the Congregational Church happily proved just what the name implied. A large audience was present in the morning for the combination church and Sunday school service. The pretty auditorium never presented a more attractive appearance, with its decorations of autumn leaves, cosmos, and chrysanthemums. This was under the skillful direction of Elliot F. Humiston. The pastor's address and the music were especially adapted to the occasion, after which the children of the Sunday school gave a program of song, recitation, and drill. Rally Day buttons were presented to the primary pupils. Superintendent H.G. Osgood, that's Houghton Osgood, and Miss Edith Wright had charge of the Sunday school exercises. The evening services were also well attended and of exceptional interest. Next section is the About Town section. Counselor Herbert E. Fletcher, reported ill last week at his home, is recovering and will be ready for town meeting. The happily successful Grieg Farm have sold their winter apples to Spencer and Lord of Boston, who furnish the barrels. The quantity and price is certain to make a, quote, barrel of money, end quote, for the raiser. This farm, the Grieg Farm, was located right across Main Street from Fairview Cemetery. The thunder shower on Tuesday evening got a blow that made it deaf and dumb, and all gossip is silenced except by wireless. Mr. Edward Riney reports that while driving near the Catholic Cemetery, Graniteville, his horse was knocked down by the lightning, and both shafts of his wagon were broken. Apparently the horse was not killed. West Chelmsford, with a little help from Westford Corner, that's in Nabnasset, what's now Nabnasset, reports 40 cases of scarlet fever, and the schools are closed for 3 weeks. Reverend Joseph S. Moulton of Stowe, a former minister of the Unitarian Church, conducted the last Sundays in exchange with Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey. Donald M. Cameron has bought a large residence at 328 Wilder Street, Lowell. The house, splendidly built with 9 rooms, was once the property of the late George E. Evans, for a long-time city engineer of Lowell. Extensive alterations have been begun by Mr. Cameron, a piazza, pantry, solarium, and bathroom being added. Along with the house, 2 lots of land were conveyed, amounting to 12,437 square feet, making an aggregate footage on 2 streets of 200 feet. In the rear, Mr. Cameron is having built a garage 22 by 26 feet. Beatrice May Johnson, youngest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. August Johnson, at the end of the Westford line near West Chelmsford, was buried on Friday afternoon, October 21st. Funeral services were held at the house at 2 o'clock, Reverend David Wallace of the Congregational Church here officiating. There were several selections sung by the Mrs. Edith, Annie, and Elsie Lundberg. From loving friends and relatives came beautiful flowers. Undertaker Grieg had charge, and the burial was in the West Chelmsford Cemetery. Beatrice was one year and 10 days old, and her parents were among the Swedish immigrants who lived in the east part of Westford. An auto accident occurred in Cold Spring Woods last week in the darkness of night and pine trees. The wagon part of the collision was wounded badly. The parties are still unknown. One person registered to vote at Brookside last week, Friday evening, and 4 at Graniteville on Monday evening, and 2 at Forts Village on Wednesday evening. The next paragraph is called A Narrow Escape. Although warned by state and town and by the recent automobile accident at the Cold Spring Farm, reckless and fast driving is still uncurbed on the public way. A narrow escape from serious collision was barely averted last week at the junction of Lowell and Stony Brook roads, known as Taylor's Corner, by the quick action of the driver of the carriage. The careful driver was coming down the hill, intending to keep on towards Stony Brook. A big automobile, driven by a Westford man, came along at a swift speed and gave no signal of approach, as should be the custom of this crossroad. It was the custom in 1910 to sound your horn when approaching an intersection in an automobile. That must have made for pretty noisy driving. The driver of the carriage had presence of mind enough to turn his horse quickly from the straight course and head him around the corner onto the low road, causing the hind wheels of the carriage to rise in the air. It was a narrow escape, and that there was no accident was due to the quick wit of the man in the carriage. Again and again, automobiles go by this crossing and give no warning nor slacken their speed. This is not the first time that similar accidents have been averted here. It seems as if auto drivers ought to be more careful at this place. This paragraph was probably written by Samuel L. Taylor, who writes the About Town section, as he lived at this corner, and it sounds like he may have witnessed this near accident. The next section is the Fords Village section. Mary I. Drake observed the 72nd anniversary of her birth on Friday, October 21st, at her home on Pleasant Street. A supper was served in the evening to a number of her friends. Her sister, Mrs. Lucretia J. Reed, assisted in entertaining their guests. Another sister, Mrs. Sarah McIntyre of Shrewsbury, her niece, Mrs. Minnie Capson, and grandniece, Miss Edith Capson, and one brother, Alvin S. Bennett, were among the guests. The little grandniece, when told to ask a blessing, said, quote, God bless those that have come. God bless those that wanted to come and couldn't. God bless those that stayed at home, end quote. A number of pretty remembrances were received, and a shower of birthday cards were received from relatives out west. The members of John Edwards Hose Company held their 3rd annual ball in Abbott Hall on Saturday evening, and in spite of the wet weather, a large number were present. Thayer's Orchestra of Pepperell furnished the music for dancing. At intermission, a supper of oyster stew, cake, and coffee was served. Guests were present from Ayer, Leominster, Littleton, Lowell, and Graniteville. Those in charge of the affair were Francis Lowther, General Manager, Edward T. Hanley, Assistant Manager, George H. Weaver, Floor Director, James Wiggum, John Sullivan, John Catchpole, and Fred Droulet, aides. Frank H. Tyzer, spelled Tyzzer, who occupies the Sunrise Cottage at Forge Pond, was here last week on a hunting trip, and his efforts were rewarded by getting 3 large black ducks. He was accompanied by Chief Edwards and the Melrose Fire Department. I wonder if the whole fire department was there. Miss Annie Long and Miss Ada Long of Lowell, former residents here, were entertained on Saturday and Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton. Reverend Max L. Kellner, professor of the Episcopal Theological School at Cambridge, occupied the pulpit at St. Andrew's Mission last Sunday, and his fine sermon on the ideal life proved very interesting. Mr. Kellner will have charge of the services again tomorrow. Reverend Arthur L. Bumpus of Belvedere, Illinois, who has been appointed vicar of St. Andrews, will preach his first sermon at the Mission Chapel in Forge Village on Sunday, November 6th. Several of the flower gardens in this vicinity are still in full bloom. Mrs. Ellen Flynn on Pond Street has a fine showing of flowers that are still untouched by the frost. Mrs. Harriet E. Randall have several roses in bloom. Vegetables are also in evidence in several of the gardens, which is unusual for this time of the year. The ringing of the bell on the fire wagon on Sunday evening at 7:15 brought the residents out in quick time on Pleasant Street. A fire was discovered by Joseph Bennett on land owned by Mrs. Harriet E. Randall on Pleasant Street and very close to several houses. Soon after the alarm was given, a stream of water put out the fire, and the excitement ended almost as soon as it began. Archie S. Bennett, professor in the English High School at Cambridge, spent the last of the week with his grandfather, Elvin S. Bennett. He has resigned his position with the school and has been appointed manager of the National Art magazine, published in Boston. And the words National Art have initial caps, so I presume that's the title of the magazine. Miss Elizabeth M. Plummer went to Salem this week to attend the 25th wedding anniversary of her sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. George Creasy, spelled Creesey. Over 300 attended the silver wedding reception held on October 25th. Miss Grace Lawrence is spending this week as the guest of her cousin, Miss Olive Prescott of Reading. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met at Recreation Hall Thursday afternoon and enjoyed a lunch and social hour at the conclusion of the work. Edward Hanley, Walter Precious, Frederick Naylor, and Warren Winslow are attending the Lowell Textile School. John P. Brown of Manchester is visiting his parents for a few days. Mrs. Michael Keefe and little son of Townsend were guests on Saturday and Sunday of Mr. and Mrs. John Carmichael. The next section is the Graniteville section. The Forge Village Graniteville combination did not prove to be strong enough to down the Buntings at football last Saturday, the Lowell club winning by 8-0. The game was played in Lowell. On account of the Democratic rally, which was held in Healy's Hall on Thursday evening, the regular meeting of Court Westford, MCOF, which stands for Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters, was held on Wednesday instead. The devotion of the Holy Rosary was held in St. Catherine's Church on Sunday evening and was largely attended. The services were conducted by Reverend M.E. Doherty, who gave a short but instructive sermon on the life of St. Joseph. A recital of the Rosary then followed with benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. In spite of the rain last Saturday night, many people from this village attended the Fireman's Dance in Forge Village and had a very enjoyable time. The speakers at the Democratic rally on Thursday night were the Honorable J.J. Mitchell, candidate for Congress in the 4th District, P.A. Kiley of Lynn, candidate for the Senate in the 7th District, and Edward Fisher of Westford, candidate for Representative. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church held their annual harvest supper and entertainment in the church vestry on Thursday evening, October 27th. Their annual affair always is looked forward to with great interest, and it was carried out in a manner to fulfill all expectations. Everybody had a good time and pronounced it the best yet. That's the news in Westford for the week ending October 29th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.